Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Doing audio only this time. I'm Jason. Today should be an interesting episode. We have two Southern boys. We got Roland Gunn and we got Sandbatch here. How's it going, guys?
Pretty good, pretty good. I just want to let everybody know we briefly thought about not doing video, but then we decided that we were too good looking and didn't want to make everybody feel bad.
Yeah, I have that problem a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but you do kind of look like a wolf, right? Roland, that's kind of your,
Yeah, that's accurate.
yeah.
It's a coyote, but
Oh, yeah. All right. So I'm already
coyote's a
familiar.
subspecies.
Yes, yes. Well, that kind of leads us into today's topic, partially, which is partially about ecology, partially about America, culture, how they interrelate. And I already got something fundamental pretty wrong, so that's embarrassing. But let's see if I can redeem myself here.
Well, I guess you got it wrong, but that's something that's come up with between me and other people 3 times this week. So that is interesting because we'll talk about the difference kind of between southern there's there's cultural differences between southern farmers and really western ranchers in a lot of ways. And one of the differences is that you don't really find Southern farmers very often with like oppositional attitudes to wolves.
Hmm.
But, people have called me out on that a number of times. They said, well, why don't you put wolves in, Tennessee or whatever? I'm like, well, I don't think they do very well there. We do have a mangy looking kind of wolf-like thing called a red wolf. There's only like 80 of them and they live in North Carolina. But other than that, we just got coyotes, you know.
Yeah. I mean, you can always try it out. Has anybody ever tried to introduce wolves?
I don't know that anybody's ever, well, there like the red wolf population, there is a real kind of haphazard effort to try and, bring them back. But really the population of them was so small that you run into problems with things like genetic drift, and the ones they do release interbreed with coyotes and create all kinds of problems. Now we've got these hybrid things stumbling around in some parts of North Carolina. I don't know that anybody's ever attempted to put gray wolves back in the American Southeast.
Hmm.
The state of Arkansas did produce a wolf report last year that claimed that somebody heard one in Arkansas, but I know they used to live here like when the English first arrived here, there were gray wolves in this part of the country, but there were also buffalo in this part of the country, and it was also it was in the middle of the little ice age, so it's not really clear if they would do very well at this point.
Right, right. What about Roland? You were talking about elephants. You want to bring elephants back to Tennessee? Do you got a plan for that?
I mean, it's more of a LARP shit post, Jason, but at the same time,
I take all of
uh,
your LARP seriously, man.
thank you. I appreciate that, buddy. Um, no, I mean, there's a real question of how much missing megafauna do we have in North America, and how does that affect our ecology here?
Yeah.
Uh, So elephants, I mean, I clearly cannot release a bunch of elephants in the American Southeast as like as a wild animal, but we do have a very large elephant sanctuary in Hohenwald, Tennessee, which is a bunch of former circus elephants, basically, and they love it there. People think elephants can't deal with snow and stuff, but they're at least in our area, because it only snows in Middle Tennessee probably 2 or 3 times a year, typically, like a real snow. And they do have barns to go into, and then kind of huddle up there, but they seem to do really well.
Yeah.
So what I was really thinking, that was like spurred by a post about a situation in Botswana, where basically the Botswanans have done such a great job with conservation that they now have a massive surplus of elephants. And the president of Botswana was like, he was like going after the president of Germany, like, you told us to save these animals, but now we have too many elephants. What are you going to do about it? And so I wanted to, let's bring a few of those to Alabama or
Yeah.
Tennessee.
I like how you
Yeah.
said Alabama, and we both know why. It's because of that awful mascot they have. But the there actually is an antecedent for doing something like this. It actually didn't work. I would warn you, this idea didn't work. But but back in the 1890s, this is an interesting thing about the South, especially the Gulf South, that I think a lot of people actually miss out on. But it's actually such an inhospitable place to live that it was relatively unsettled well into the 1890s and the early 1910s, and even to this day, there are huge chunks of it that just look like this kind of blasted moonwalk wasteland. But there used to not be very many people that lived here, and so there were always lots of cockamamie schemes to try to get people to move here. And one guy did at some point in the distant past, came up with this idea that the Barataria Terrebonne estuary, which is about, I'm in New Orleans, it's about 150 miles west of me. Like if you drew a line straight west of me, you'd land in the middle of probably the largest saltwater marsh in the world, or freshwater swamp left in the world. And there was a guy that about in like early 1910s came up with this idea that we were going to put hippos there,
Hmm.
and that hippos were going to be raised in Southwest Louisiana for the meat and for the skin. I don't know that ever got much beyond a pilot, but I know there were briefly hippos in southern Louisiana. So importing African megafauna it sounds strange, but it's not totally beyond the pale.
Hmm.
Well, there's a real life situation in Colombia where, and I forget the guy's name, but one of those narco lords brought a bunch of elephants to Colombia. And after they like arrested him, some of the elephants escaped into a local river, and now they have a massive. They haven't. I'm sorry, elephants. I'm saying elephants. Hippos. And now they have a major like hippo infestation in Colombia.
This is Columbia, the country, not Columbia, South Carolina.
No, yeah, Colombia, South
I was
America.
going to be like, I've spent quite a bit of time in Colombia. Nobody showed me the hippos. It doesn't make me believe they're not there. But I was like, I've never seen the hippos in Columbia, South Carolina. But it's really just kind of like talking about bringing elephants here. I think Empty America, Adam Ben, uh, old Buskirk was talking about this as well. But really, that's just one of those things it's kind of like a real big dipstick marker for well, why not elephants? Because we already have, and I've actually seen quite a bit of discourse about this in the last couple of weeks. That's sort of interesting. That what exactly makes an ecosystem? What is a natural ecosystem? Do we have any of them in the Southeast already? Like, and I have a couple of articles that I'm going to publish pretty soon about this. If I step outside my door right now, I live in the mid-city neighborhood in New Orleans. I step outside right before I got on this recording. There were two lizards on my front porch. Two different kinds of lizards. We have 14 kinds of lizards in Louisiana, including two geckos, both of which are introduced, and then we have these this pair of lizards. One of them is the green anole, which is probably, if you live in the southeast, this is what the thing you call a lizard because it's so prevalent. It's this little green lizard, and it can turn brown, which is what makes this kind of confusing. But it can briefly turn brown. And then there's another lizard that was just recently introduced here, and it's called De La Sagres anole, or the Cuban brown anole. And the little brown ones are actually viciously extirpating the native green ones. And the two species of gecko that I just mentioned in the city of New Orleans, both of them are introduced. We have another issue with a very large spider that lives here. I don't know I mean, you could Google pictures of this for like the pornographic effect and be like, never go to that part of the country. But we have a native spider here that's called the golden orb weaver. This is the one that they use the silk from to make bulletproof things, and it's got an incredibly high tensile strength. Well, the native population of these is also being displaced by, a very similar looking Japanese spider. So you can look at you can look at an issue like, oh, should we bring elephants into into America? and what are the ramifications of that? What are the ethics of it? Can we handle it? But when you really actually drill down on it, we do this all the time. There's I think nine, but there's like nine active, like if you use the terminology of invasive species, there's nine active invasions occurring in the city of New Orleans right now, never mind in the swamps outside it. you
Mm.
know
Mm.
we're always doing, and we have this whenever it's real interesting. I mean, I would call myself, politically, if there's anything I am, it's a bioregionalist. But a bioregionalist here, and classically what you're going to call the edge of a bioregion is kind of where the ecosystem changes,
Right.
or where the collection of ecosystem changes. But here I am also on this, on the same note, questioning whether or not there is such a thing as a natural ecosystem. you
Mm.
know
You mean like a pristine ecosystem, like the idea that's untouched by humans, or what do you mean?
well, yeah, I mean, okay, so pristine, untouched is probably the way most people would do, but there's probably gradations in this sort of term, natural. Like, what does someone term natural? Is it natural for humans to affect it somewhat? Um, but generally, and there's this old movie, Midnight in Paris, Woody Allen movie, where there it's this writer. He's uh, on the down and outs in Paris in the 2010s, and he's got this idea that if he goes back to 1920 or whatever, he'll be inspired to write because he'll be around all these famous people in Paris. And this woman that the love interest, calls it golden age thinking. I think a lot of times there's kind of a concept of, sort of golden age thinking whenever we use this phrase nature, or we use this phrase, a natural ecosystem or an untouched ecosystem or something like that. It almost always tends to imply something in the past
Mhm.
that was fundamentally altered, and usually almost always a negative way. You don't find a lot of people, for instance, wanting to, return to the state where certain aspects of modern medicine are gone. But whenever we say, "Oh, well, we need to get back, we need to get closer to nature," we're always talking about undoing things that we have like termed sort of negative.
Mhm.
And so the way I've sort of seen, and I've seen this very recently, maybe because I'm looking more than I used to. Um, but I see a lot of times I'll see people using things like arguments in favor of the existence of a pristine natural ecosystem to it it really eventually becomes more of a political point than it does like an actual point of contention that people want to use to solve a problem, or something like that. And I think like sometimes we have these issues that maybe we should just step over instead of like really be terribly concerned with them right now. You could take an issue like, okay, is there any potential upside to putting elephants in the southeast? Like, I'm not sure that there would be, but it does provide kind of a really red flag, a really easy to recognize example. How would you lead into talking about this? What exactly is an ecosystem? And the other example I would use to like sort of make this point is that I mean, I think almost everybody's familiar with this particular fish. It's called a rainbow trout.
Mhm.
And this thing actually, I mean, it probably lives in every American's mind as an idea, except for people who are really into fly fishing. It probably lives in every American's mind as an example of a fish that naturally lives in the rivers. Trout have a lot of things that lend themselves to that mythology. They don't do very well in dirty water. They need cold water, so it makes people who are real concerned about global warming, it's a good touchstone species for them. People who are concerned about pollution, it's a good touchstone species for them. There's a problem though, which is that the rainbow trout is native to like two tiny little rivers in California, and everywhere else it lives in America, it's been introduced and deliberately stocked. So you have this question now: does that count as a natural ecosystem? Is an ecosystem that has a rainbow trout in it, is it natural? And then can you really complain about moving elephants in?
Yeah.
Because there's no negative ramifications that we can see for moving elephants in, but we know moving rainbow trout in actually extirpated native trout. So there's a lot of questions that get raised around what seems like a pretty innocuous question.
Yeah, that's a whole. I mean, this is a whole thing.
Sorry, that was a
I
lot of
think
talking at once.
no. I mean, I think yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, we have to get away from what's like this natural ecosystem because there hasn't been a time in a very long time when humans haven't been a part of these ecosystems and have been changing them. So then the question is like, what is healthy? But even that's problematic. Like, what does a healthy ecosystem mean? Does it mean, okay, there's not one species that's like smothering all of the rest, right? You have, I mean, I would think you presumably have some kind of keystone, a few keystone species that, provide habitats some way for many other species. You have some kind of biocomplexity, I guess would be another definition. But, besides that, I think, yeah, I mean, I think we have to get away from, what was it in the past? What should it be? And I think we have to do some experimentation, some tinkering. We're not gods, but we do have some ability to respond and adapt and think rationally. But we still might screw it up. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a tough question.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Roland.
even even more. I mean, the rainbow trout is one thing, but many people don't know that this country before the Columbian exchange did not have earthworms. Earthworms are not native to the Americas,
Yeah.
and those suckers came over here on like ballast stones and stuff, and now they're all over the continent. And there's reason to believe that one of the reasons that we have, as Mr. Buzzkirk says, Euro formed North America in terms of the sort of the grasses and the plant life is that the native grasses and stuff evolved in a system without earthworms as tillers, and things like clover and some of the other common grasses are Euro evolved to deal with or benefit from earthworms. So
Mhm.
it's I mean it's like Sandy was saying, like it's already the system is already wonky. There's no pristine environment.
Yeah. Well, this brings me to kind of one of the themes I wanted to talk about, on this episode, and it's from a tweet that you wrote a while back. I think I've lost track of it now, but you were talking about how you're thinking about the South, and you had a kind of an issue with this notion of like recovering the traditional, and you wanted to kind of like bring the life ways into the future. I'll find that quote, but do you know
Oh, I
what
remember
I'm
it.
talking about?
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah, that was because that's one of every once in a while I'll say something on Twitter that gets even people that I listen to get mad at me, and that
That was
was
one of
one
them.
of the ones. But so look, so my background is I have, and you would think I have an ecology background, but I really don't. I just stayed in Holiday Inn last night. I have a background in Southern literature and in Southern history, and really, I've worked all over the South. The South has been a constant. In addition to being from here, occasionally you run into people that get like, oh, that guy, the red diaper baby character that wrote the New Freedom or whatever. You'll run into people who are really inordinately fixated on the South who aren't from here. I am from here, and I'm inordinately fixated on it. And I've always been really since I was probably 18 or 19, I've been concerned about what the Southern tradition is and what, if anything, needs to be, can be salvaged from it, or what, if anything, needs to be discarded from it. And that really, I mean, it's a really complicated question. There's a lot goes into it and a lot goes out of it. But the historical condition that I've sort of identified is that I think Southerners in particular, Southerners are, I mean, this is, when you talk about regions of America, there's probably not a more well-defined one. Most people would assume that there's not a more well-defined one, but they would also discover that if they tried to fix a point, and this is great pastime on Twitter. I see people doing it all the time. Trying pinning down exactly what it is kind of hard. And if you want to figure out whether or not it has it has a tradition, you got to kind of be able to have an idea of that. And then if you want to be able to figure out if there's something from this tradition that needs to be saved or discarded, that's even another extrapolation. But the historical circumstances I've kind of found the South in, and this is just from living here, from studying it, from being around it my entire, being in it most of my life, is that Southerners are very concerned about their identity. And there's a tendency to want to, they'll want to hold on to specific aspects of themselves that they know about in the past. And there's not a whole lot of what I would call self-reflection about it. And this, when I start saying things like this is when I start veering into like the, University of Mississippi Southern Studies Department faculty talk. But I think there are definitely things that the current iteration, especially the current iteration of, how the South conceives itself traditionally, probably maintain some things that have been desperately poisonous to us, and desperately poisonous in a way that has allowed us to retain a very special identity. But, my sort of operating point is that, really things like fundamental opposition to involvement with, government funding mechanisms. That's a sort of, you look at that, you look at the South right now, and almost unrelievedly across the southern states, you'll find incredible opposition to taking advantage of any kind of federal program or anything like that. And so the things I like to go back and look at are, does that really actually represent us, or is that an explicitly sort of ideological perspective that's been adopted more recently? And, is that really part of what causes us to drink sweet tea and sit on the porch and talk slow? Like, if we drop opposition to participating in any kind of federal programs whatsoever, do we do we still get to call ourselves Southerners? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And I think that the South in particular, and oftentimes it doesn't even have to really change thinkers. There's a big, strong, especially among people who spend a lot of time on the internet, there's a big, considerably more interest in this group of people called the fugitive poets, that wrote "I'll Take My Stand" than there was when I was an undergrad. Like, when I was an undergrad, "I'll Take My Stand," these books, like, they were called books that everyone read, but I didn't know another person that read one. Now people are all over the place and they know what these things are. But, sometimes I think they're a little willing to pick up maybe bits and pieces that they find in that text that speak to their current political desires rather than their current political needs. And I think they de-emphasize some aspects of it, some aspects, especially of the text "I'll Take My Stand," and I think they emphasize other aspects of it that are, sort of problematic now. And the number one thing that I think they overlook is that there's a theme running through, "I'll Take My Stand," where the 12 Southerners who wrote the book are low key making an argument that, well, they're sitting in Tennessee, they're sitting at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, and they're looking back out over America.
Mhm.
And they're clever people. They're not dumb, they're educated, but they're not really they're still part of this weird, region that's kind of still shut out of American life because the Civil War is less than a generation earlier. And they've got a real outsider's perspective on it. And they're able to look at it, and they're saying, this is the thing America is becoming. It's becoming this financialized, capitalized, atomized, sort of society. And these are the fruits of industrial civilization. But then they also look and they say, well, look at the South. We haven't done any of that yet. And so and in the essay on the economy, I think it's called "Wither Southern Economy," there's a strong implication there that, well, maybe we can possibly just skip all of the bad parts. We could skip this step and just arrive in the future at some, undecided date, and, we'll be right with it again. we won't be looked at as backwards. We'll be participating in the forefront of the global economy, the global marketplace of ideas, if you believe in, a concept like that. And that has been in the past the state of the South. If you look at the South, a considerable amount of America's cultural, culinary, and even intellectual values, are derived from Southerners. If you look around, though, you don't see a lot of that today. And so the South is obviously not intellectually in a great place right now. It's obviously not culturally in a great place right now. Economically, it's starting to look pretty good. And I think, if there was a time for Southerners to just sort of ditch the concepts of the 20th, so ditch the baggage of the 20th century and just step over it and step forward into the future, that now is probably, I don't think the getting gets any better from here on out. Sorry, that was a lot again.
Yeah. Well, I was just reading through your initial new Substack post, Ecologica Americana, which I want you to talk about as
Yeah.
well. But a couple of the phrases that stuck out to me here. One is you say it's taken me 17 years to realize the only substantive use of history is to cure yourself of history. You talk about we're talking about history. We're really talking about unveiled. Or let me just read it. When we talk about history, what we are really doing is talking about the future in very veiled mythological terms. And then you kind of define mythology as opposed to ideology, and you bring in this concept of cybernetic. Mythology is cybernetic. It's interactive. One person's outputs is somebody else's inputs. Do you want to riff on that a little bit and how this
Yeah,
relates?
yeah, yeah. We can talk about that a little bit, and also why the Substack posts don't come as frequently as they should. Because whenever I'm talking about the different, well, first, there's a lot there. We go all the way back to the beginning. The bit about curing yourself of history really ties into the ideological point. And this is something that I'm actually drawing from an essay called "Every Man His Own Historian," which was written by Carl Becker. It's one of the most widely read history journal articles ever written. If you ever go, everyone in grad school has to read this thing like day one. Where what Carl Becker was an American. He's not an English historian or anything like that. He's an American. He wrote a book called "The Heavenly City of the 18th Century" about the fundamental Christianity of the founding of the American founding. And really about, he wrote about Europe and a bunch of others, but in this particular essay, "Every Man His Own Historian," he points out that what history actually is to people are the bits and pieces of the past that they perceive as bearing on their present. And he's actually riffing a little bit he's riffing a little bit from Marx there. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx says something like, "Men make their own history, but they don't make it under self-selected circumstances." And the something about the tradition of all generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, something horrifying like that. And Becker is really, whenever he's referring to every man as his own historian, he's referring to this like very kind of very 20th century idea that what we can do is create a specious present. Now, specious present is all of the aspects of the past that you're able to juggle at one time, when they're bearing down upon the present. There's a weakness here, though, and the weakness, I think, in a large degree, comes down through what the methods of information dissemination we have. Whenever I talk about ideology, not mythology. Whenever I talk about ideology, I'm not necessarily referring to it the same way most people do, though it's not a weird enough definition that like people would, be like, call me a revisionist or, some strange, out in left field, idea. I'm working with a German historian, and I always mispronounce his name, Reinhard Koselleck. He was Jürgen Habermas's bête noire. If you're more familiar with Habermas, and he comes to this conclusion that ideology is not really an idea so much as it's a political technology. It's a tool. It's a thing that is used to move people around on the board. And that, in the 19th and 20th century, ideology was very useful because it was something you could use. You don't have internet, you don't have ways of like moving information back and forth between people, very strongly. You certainly can't handle very much bottom up participation. And in modern discourse, there's a lot of arguments about top down versus bottom up and that sort of thing. And what I'm really sort of saying is that we also have to kind of step over that, because we can talk about bottom up versus top down, but the thing that's really interesting to me here is that ideology is interesting as a political technology that's effective in the 19th century, because you can do this thing where you can write down a party plank, or you can create a manifesto, and you're like physically transmuting words onto a piece of paper that is then disseminated. And you're essentially making a copy of ideas and putting them in another person's head. And the manifesto and the party plank and the party platforms are very common examples of it. And what they're really doing here is you have to there's some information design foibles occurring in the 19th century as well, because you have space constraints. What they're essentially trying to do with ideology is they're trying to take as few words as possible and cover as many broad ideas as you can without creating an inference feedback loop that runs back up the chain to where the ideas originated. So this is a very one-way relationship. There's an intellectual or a party official or a printing press or a whole country printing what's essentially a set of instructions about how to think. And because of the technological limitations, they really can't handle a lot of bottom up feedback. In fact, bottom up feedback is usually punished with grape shot, because the only real mechanism for self assorting that existed is to produce a counter manifesto or literally just hit the streets. And the most famous example of that's 1848, which is the Communist Manifesto. If you ever read it, it's a really exciting read, specifically because it was written to be distributed on the barricades in the 1848 revolution. So there's this whole 200-year epic of American world history that's more or less defined by this very one-way information dissemination mechanism that I call it ideology. Here's your set of instructions. Here's how to vote. Here's how you go think. Cybernetics is sort of the exact opposite of that, which is that and it deliberately creates feedback loop systems. That's really, people talk about cybernetics and they have this idea that it has specifically something to do with computers, but it doesn't. It's a communications term, and really all it means is that all communication systems are composed of feedback loops that themselves create other feedback loops. The way the technology comes in is that how do we handle that many feedback loops at once? That didn't sound too crazy, did it? Everybody's still with me?
No, it doesn't
Yeah.
sound too crazy. And there's reinforcing and there's stabilizing feedback loops as well, which might play into the picture. But
Right. Yeah. That's a little more complicated. Attempting to just lay out the basic concept here. But I'd also point out that we live more or less in a situation where ideology has functionally failed. And that's really what we see. In my opinion, when we look at the crisis of democracy, and I've been looking at this for a while too. And I don't really see a crisis of democracy, so I just see a crisis of the political technology is no longer working, or in other words, the other technologies, other communication technologies have sort of progressed to the point where ideology has to start becoming very desperate, because it has to close down other avenues and other possibilities of thought. It has to eliminate any competing feedback loop, and there are just too many of them now for what is essentially a technology that's about on the same age range as the first stabilizers that were put in bread, that to make bread last. It's a very old technology now, and it's sort of gone by the wayside, but it's trying very hard to hang on. And the reason I said cure yourself of history is because history, and I'm referring to capital H history whenever I say this. This is, now we're squarely in the tradition of German idealism, which has this idea that, there's this capital H thing called history, that perfectly explains, all of the context of the present. that, if you understand this thing that is capital H history, and in capital H history in the past, there were things that were done that were mistakes. The formation wheeled right at this battle when it should have wheeled left, and then one of the things that does is create a sub debate. But history has an answer. History has a very defined set of inputs that result in a very defined set of outputs, and as a result of this, it ends up being one of the main vectors of just ideology. And if you look on Twitter, you can see this everywhere. I think in one very real sense, this conversation about what is a natural versus an artificial ecosystem is an outgrowth of this question of history. So, like, again, like I was saying with natural, there was some point in the past when this thing was right, and then we did something to mess it up, and now we got to change it again. You have to kind of, if you want to be able to move to work cooperatively, and what, I don't see a way around, really a perpetuating democratic system. I'm not sure we really want to. But one of the things if we're going to be here, and we're going to have to work together, and we're going to have to manage to get things done, we're going to have to figure out a way to manage these feedback loops in such a way that we don't end up arguing over things like whether the South should have won the Civil War, or whether a natural ecosystem exists. These are similar problems in a sense, in that there's not really a lot other than politics that goes into deciding them, and there's not really a win condition for anyone.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring you in here. You were earlier today in a chat, you were talking about this kind of notion of regional futurism, Southern futurism, Midwest futurism, and you defined it as looking at like 50 years in the future, and seeing like what is something that holds true to that region's values but is better than today. And you said you use that to set goals, and I'm wondering, maybe this is hopefully this is not a gotcha question, but is setting those goals for like 50 years from now, is that kind of overly determining what a future would be? Is it allowing for these kind of cybernetic feedbacks to to kick in?
Hmm. No, I think Jason, what I would have used, the term I would have used had Neil not been in the chat, would be vision casting, or dream casting, or dreaming.
Hmm.
Uh, it's to me, that is more about unleashing the power of the human imagination upon the world, in a way, again, that is, like Sandy is saying, unconstrained from ideology. Because another thing about ideology is, let's consider like the two competing ideologies. That's a very broad, like, probably an overgeneralization, but we could talk about like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in this country, and their platforms as sort of a limited manifestation of ideology. Uh, ugh, even that's not great. But if you
No,
think
that's
about
great.
like
I mean, I think you're right.
uh, if you think about like what those two parties are fighting over, valence issues like abortion, gun control, uh, how much money we should spend on solar panels, that kind of thing. How much money do we should give to Israel? Uh, these are actually a very small portion of the problems that face the United States as a society, and the problems that face us on a local level in a place like where I am in Middle Tennessee, or you in North Carolina, or Sandy down in the Gulf. So I would, when I'm talking about like regional futurism, I'm thinking about what are the real problems that we are missing when we are tapped into the Twitter feed of libs of TikTok ism, and all these talking heads who are keeping us constantly fixated on transgender sports or drag queen story hour, etc. When you have, that I'm not saying that those things don't matter, because I do think that there are real questions in terms of like gender and stuff. But in terms of like the spectrum of your life or my life and the life of a community and the life of a nation, this is a very tiny sliver of human experience that we're focusing inordinate amount of thought, energy, and time and focus on, and in some cases money, in terms of transferring that into political pacts and stuff like that. So futurism can be used as a way to shift people outside of that limiting box, limiting ideological box, just considering what do we want? What do we want out of life? What do we want out of a country? What do we want out of wherever you are?
Mm.
No, I mean, I think that's great, and that actually brings up a perfect example. I'm going to bring it all home here in the South right now. Now, there are some conditions for. I laid out some conditions for ideologization, and that's a word that only a German theorist could use. But the base cause of sort of why did ideology proliferate, and that's because of this very strange consequence of really participatory government that's called the crisis situation. And ideology is usually manifested along what are termed crisis situations. The American Revolution was one. What is the most famous pamphlet written about the American Revolution was called The Crisis, and then we see this word crop up over and over again. It is a word that doesn't really exist before the 18th century, and then it starts cropping up in this modern context that we use it in. And what a crisis is an issue that is perceived as so dreadful that neither side is able to back down from it, and it has an all-subsuming importance to it. There are a lot of national issues currently. In fact, the Democrat and the Republican parties both rely on these gigantic issues that they can suck all attention into in order ultimately to harvest resources, to move people, to move votes around the country so they can become the regime in power and then utilize the capital resources of the whole country. Okay, this is basically the blueprint for how the modern nation state works. Um, and one of the things that it does is it takes this to look at a situation like these protests that have been happening in Mississippi, and I'm going to grab Alabama here too. But you have this situation where college students in Mississippi and on one side, and college students in Mississippi on another team have basically like picked red and blue team over what ultimately is the issue of who is your not least favorite foreign government. And they got so violent with one another. They got so violent, so combative with one another. Some of them have probably ruined their lives, that it made national news. Meanwhile, I mean, these are issues that don't really touch the state of Mississippi at all. Whereas a more genuinely future-oriented outlook for Mississippi would look at an issue like, what are the problems and what are the real problems Mississippi faces? Since we're talking about climate and biodiversity and this sort of thing, I would point out that the Monsanto Corporation, which is possibly the most evil, corporation of the last 300 years, is based in Mississippi. That probably the number one day-to-day, problem in the state of Mississippi is this issue called non-point source solution, where chemical runoff causes the water to turn poisonous, and then it flows into the Mississippi River and it comes down and makes a huge dead spot in the Gulf of Mexico. And the reason this happens is because the Mississippi state government continuously lets Tyson Chicken and a few other companies off the hook. Issues that really facing Mississippi is that, and there were a lot of posts going around about this, that traditionally Southern agricultural companies are, selling large stakes of their business to China. It's very common to point out that jobs are coming back to the South right now, but what they don't tell you is that these are usually jobs that are coming in from foreign-owned companies because GOP legislators, the state legislators, are usually willing to pass absurd corporate exemptions for these companies to set up shop here. So we have this situation where, the South is becoming a wonderful place to do business. It's becoming a wonderful place to live, but you don't really see the Southern people taking advantage of these opportunities. They don't get a lot of the windfall from the money that's flowing in because it's been done through, it's been done through foreign actors. It's been done through actors that are in better money parts of the country. I think it makes sense to me that a more genuinely future oriented, Southern people would be more concerned about that than they would be about the funding that we slice up for Israel or Palestine and they wouldn't let that. They certainly wouldn't let this, what ultimately the specter of James Meredith and the 1964 riots. Really, what we've seen in the last 3 days is a situation where this contemporary issue on the other side of the world has taken on the valences of the past. Both sides here, the Hicklibs and the people who are or on the other side who are participating, in ways that you wouldn't want people to participate in publicly. Both of them have the history problem. They both have the history problem and the ideology problem, and they're missing things. They're missing opportunities to make very important strides in their own backyard as a result of it. I mean, could you imagine if the University of Mississippi had a campus-wide protest of Tyson chicken, that dumps incredible amounts of incredible amounts of chicken waste directly in Mississippi's rivers? Would that make the news? Like what? I don't know. I would like to see it, but it certainly beats more of what is the same, which is this thing that's governed by the expectations of the other of circumstances dictated from the past. Sorry, that was a lot again.
Yeah. Well, Roland, I want to bring you back in again because things you have said that keep coming to mind as Sandy talks here. So you've been you seem pretty bullish in your life. I think your life circumstances are going pretty well. And that's translating partially into kind of bullishness about, the South and the region. Do you have thoughts about kind of what Sandy's saying about, how we're thinking about, what is actually in, say, Southern best interests or some regional best interests? Like, I don't know. And you've also talked about, I don't know, maybe getting into politics and stuff. I wonder if you have thoughts about kind of, this kind of how Sandy's laying this out here.
Are you talking about how we're going to bring back the Southern Democrats, right?
Well, yeah, I didn't want to say, I didn't know if that was public yet, but I'm
That's what Sandy and I are working on.
politics.
We're not gonna say Southern Democrat. We're gonna say Yellow Dog Democrat. That doesn't get anybody's hackles up.
Uh, yeah, no. I'll just give. Uh, I'm a weird guy, and so is Sandy, and so are you. So we're all weirdos. Um, After law school, actually, there's a lot of reasons, but I did not take the bar for several years after getting out of law school, and I did a lot of different stuff. And one of the things I did was I spent about a year as a welder. I trained as a welder and worked as a welder in a machine shop in a factory. Uh, and that was a massively eye-opening experience for me. I don't want to work blue collar, but I learned a lot about what that is like for people.
Mhm.
And going back to what Sandy's saying about people not benefiting, this is a situation in which at one time we had like a chemical fire in the factory, and the factory is like filled with like billowing chemical smoke that would probably give you cancer, and like we probably would have had cancer in like like a year or something. And the managers, and this is okay, another thing, this is a Canadian company that has been invited down here to Tennessee to build auto parts as part of this massive industrialization of the South that's going on. And they did not, they wanted us to go back into the factory with the chemical smoke still in the air. And one of the reasons that these companies love coming to the South is that we have right to work, which, is more like right to be fired, frankly. There are some individual benefits for that, and it does bring in some jobs from places which have unions, but there's a lot of drawbacks for that for the working class people, blue collar people. And then now, as an attorney, I've been practicing for 7 years now. Uh, One of the things I occasionally get phone calls about is workers' comp. They call our office like asking for like a workers' comp attorney. There really aren't any workers' comp attorneys in Tennessee anymore. There's a handful of people that do that stuff, but basically in the early mid 2000s, we had a very pro business Democratic governor, Phil Bredesen, former mayor of Nashville, and they've been trying to pass workers' comp reform for a long time. And he was the one that got it done. It was workers' comp reform was passed by a Democratic governor in collusion with the state Republicans. And what that effectively means in Tennessee is we don't really have workers' comp in the way that you might in a state like California or Illinois or something, where you will oftentimes have an attorney and you can essentially try it like a lawsuit and put on evidence and stuff. There's just not an incentive for me as an attorney to take one of these cases because there is not for one, it's a lot harder to fight them, and two, they've cut out the compensation that you might get as an attorney to make this something that I would want to do. And people, a lot of people hate attorneys, and I get that because there's a lot of bad attorneys out there. But if you are a person who cares about everyday people, let's be frank, many of these people are not super intelligent. They're not highly educated. That's very common in the South. It's white, black, brown, etc. Those people, when they go up against an employer or the government or contractor, anybody, they need legal counsel. And oftentimes they cannot afford to pay me. And I, as a small business owner with employees and rent and all this other expenses, and I got to pay myself, I can't afford to be doing pro bono cases all the time. And then we have a public defender's office, which obviously needs to be focusing on public defenders. And so basically, yeah, Sandy's right. There's a lot of problems with this sort of, flip to the Republican Party. I'm not happy about the Republicans in a lot of ways. And and then the other side of that is that we have in the South a Democratic Party now, which because of national influence, uh, is not dissimilar from in many cases, not dissimilar from the Democratic Party you might find in Oregon, where they are taking more seriously left-wing positions on something like trans rights or something like that. And so because those valence issues like transgenderism, abortion are such a big deal for Southern evangelicals and Catholics, etc., people are not going to vote for that party. So it leaves us in a situation where there is a dominant Republican Party, which is controlled by big business effectively. There is this sort of insurgent liberty movement in there, but they're not, I mean, in some ways, they're not that different. What they're harder about is, they're more socially conservative or they're more anti illegal immigration, that kind of thing. They're not covering like workers' rights or workers' comp or anything like that, or environmentalism. And so there is this massive gap in the Southern political landscape for a party, to take on this monopoly. And right now, it's not the Democratic Party. Sorry if that was too political, but
You have to understand this is kind of this is not an easy admission for me to make, because this is like in a lot of ways, this is very contrary to the concept of the way Southerners have thought about themselves in really for several generations. But what I'm really saying is that we have a serious problem with the political class in the Southern United States that generates an incredible number of knock-on effects. And the corollary there is that political class is very frequently the same class of people who are the business owners and so on and so forth. And they tend to be the very same families that ran the plantation system, that frequently Southerners want to look back on as a golden era, or as an era whenever we really were something, and that was when we were a people and that sort of thing. I'm saying that thing is actually still here with us, and it's just as ugly as it was then, and it's just as constraining as it was then. But now the scale is much larger, and it is in fact not only causing us not only causing us individually economic problems, it's causing us health problems, it's causing us environmental problems. And the only real way I see out of it is to kind of snap totally out of what is the national political frame game, and instead concentrate very heavily on a few key issues that would be, public health. Workers' rights is one that I don't know much about, and I'm glad Roland was here to sort of, talk us through that. But the thing that concerns me the most is that Southerners are currently very willing to take a pay. In fact, I actually took. I think she's been on. I think she's been on this show before. I took a friend of mine out to see the plantations, and the plantations and the chemical factories, not too far from here out west. And one of the things we noticed is that everybody seems to have a brand new pickup truck, but this is also in a part of the country. It's called Cancer Alley, because people live 10 years, life expectancy is 10 years shorter. So there is a tendency among, Southern voters, the Southern normal people, to look at the situation and say right to work is fine because, and, non-unionization is fine because I get to negotiate my salary directly with the corporation that pays me. And they do bribe pretty well. They bribe you well enough to live not badly in the circumstances that they create. But as a general rule, what we're seeing is Louisiana is the worst about it. Louisiana just raffled off a substantial chunk of its longleaf pine timber right to a Canadian company, and the way they front that is it's going to bring jobs in, and the final estimate is it's going to bring about 10 permanent mid-senior level positions to the state, and then a bunch of temporary contract labor. And what we've done in return for that, to boost boost our temporary economics numbers, is we've traded, a substantial chunk of our natural resources that can't easily be regrown. And now we also have the smackdown strike, the lithium strike that's occurred, in northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas. And whenever I say, when I talk about futurism, I say, dude, is there any political voice current? Is there any political? Is there any cultural? Is there any communicative voice that's currently with any prominence that's talking about anything like that, or is everyone constantly being, reverted back to look at the jobs numbers, look at the real estate numbers in Florida? Everything is booming and it's not going to get any worse. This is really the kind of thinking that's kept us in this curious role in the American story, where we're kind of backwards, but also too big and rich to really care about. I think if Southerners were really looking to be proactive and really looking, really sick of the national political scene, they would start looking at things like, well, who's going to protect, we have to live here for forever, in perpetuity. Maybe we should be a little bit concerned about the process of lithium mining. Maybe we should be willing to cooperate with the federal government if they're willing to help us, conserve some of this land. Maybe we should be willing to step up and get some of this smackdown strike money ourselves. Right now, most of the development plans that I've been seeing, they're companies that are based out of California that are, they're propositioning the Louisiana and Arkansas state governments to perform work here, and they're going to receive tax exemptions. People here are going to, their duck hunting spot's going to get obliterated by, lithium fumes. And, then they're going to die 10 years earlier. And the only thing they will have had to show for that is 10 years or so of an extra $2,000 a month. And I don't, and I would like to think positively that if someone that, positively enough to think that if someone were able to explain this to them, that they would understand it, that it's a communication issue right now is what I think it is. I don't think it's a permanent problem with this particular population. I'd have to give up on a lot to think that.
Hmm. So this, I mean,
Yeah,
go ahead, Ron.
yeah. I just want to add two short more anecdotes in Tennessee. Right now, the Republican Party is trying to pass, and they may have passed it already, basically a modification to allow them to build in flood zones in West Tennessee, which is where most of our wetlands is. And that's obviously dumb for a lot of reasons. It's not just environmental reasons. I mean, do you want to buy a house in a flood zone? uh, and I've had people here that have called me up. They contractor got a modification on a flood zone issue, and this guy's house looks like it has a basement, but it's really just a giant crawl space, which is designed to allow floodwater to like flow underneath this man's house, and he didn't know. Uh, and another one right now, I've got some cases where I'm fighting with a pipeline company, uh, and our state government has given and the federal government has given pipeline companies a lot of eminent domain powers, and those companies are extremely wealthy, and the people that they are targeting for eminent domain, there's no way to stop the eminent domain, and I'm not trying to stop it, but the way they do it is this sort of classic thing where the guy shows up at your property and like slaps down a bunch of papers and says, I'll pay you $5,000 for this permanent easement across your property. And then if you look at him sideways, he just says, well, I'm going to get it anyway. Uh, so, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of this stuff going on.
Hmm. Okay, so is there, I mean, you've talked about, Roland, as well, of like, industrialism can be good. Like we should, we shouldn't be afraid of it. Um, is there a way to improve people's material qualities of life while avoiding these issues? Like, is this just a fundamental trade-off? Um, is there just a way to like, okay, some people are going to get sick, but we're going to distribute the profits better in this region or something? Like what is, there seems to be these kind of intractable trade-offs between like what is our kind of vision for vision for Tennessee in the next 10, 20 years, under my ideal circumstances, or or Louisiana, New Orleans, whatever. Are there just these fundamental trade-offs that no matter how we change our paradigm, we, cure ourselves of history, et cetera, that we just can't avoid?
Man, that's a tough question, Jason.
Well,
You,
what would be an example of a negative trade-off? Like, so what are we trading off?
Well, I mean, if you want, people want jobs, right? And you're trying to attract industry to come in, right? And it has, not a perfect, environmental footprint, right? Like, is it just finding kinds of industry that are, quote unquote, cleaner, or that distribute the wealth better, Yeah, I mean, like, how do we square this kind of, we need jobs, we need, a lot of, poor people want more material, access, material goods, but, is there a way to get that without the downsides, I guess?
I mean, what I really think is that there has to be the way, and there probably will be downsides in the short term, but one of the things that I think really need is a lot of issues could be solved is if, particularly because the South is the only actual instance, and I guess you could say Houston kind of counts, but I'm not sure Houston really counts. The South is the only region of the country that has this like large and has this large and increasing share of economic activity, but the region itself tends to be a brain drain because people don't want to move, people don't want to live here. The reason people don't want to live here is because it's pretty hard to start a business from here. It's pretty hard to do, it's pretty hard to, there are a lot of things, a lot of hoops you have to jump through to be able to do anything except take essentially salary positions from very large companies. And I think in the short term, this is going to produce some actual leaning into, the governing system, which will involve changing it somewhat, state level in particular, but also at the federal level. I think federal money is going to have to be actually used to create some sort of critical mass, probably around one or two cities. I mean, I don't know. You're in North Carolina, I would assume Asheville or the Research Triangle or somewhere like that. Those are possibilities. I don't think New Orleans is a possibility. This place is going to get probably deleted this year. But I think if you could stop the brain drain, what is ultimately brain drain from the South, and actually get it to start retaining some of its more talented minds, I think a lot of these problems would start solving themselves, and you could like pull back the throttle on, government funding. But one of the things, one of the things people might say to that is we do fund a lot of things in the South. The South is getting a lot of federal funding. But again, I would point that if you look at what actually goes on, you find that a lot of work gets. This is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of Mike Johnson, because he's real bad about shuffling work performed in his district out to sort of more national brands. I think what we have a real issue with is there's lots of theoretical money coming in here, but it's jangling around just a few pockets, and a lot of it goes back out. I think maybe there is a permanent trade-off. Maybe we have to be a little less ideologically focused on things like, you know, our liberties. Maybe we will have to actually change the way we think about, cooperative action, and look at some of the things that places have done successfully and kind of replicate them. But I think ultimately that what is really needed is critical mass, and what we actually just need to get better at doing is recognizing the resources that we have available to us, and capitalizing on them. I'm a real optimistic person though. Like it's easy to look at some of the things I say and go, well, that obviously ain't gonna work.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, and you know this, Jason, but for the sake of the listeners, we've made a lot of progress environmentally in the last century. Uh, the bald eagle, classic, beautiful symbol of America. I'm about to go down to Reelfoot and hang out at my hunting lodge. And at one time there were no bald eagles in Tennessee, and now they're everywhere. So using the power of the state to either disincentivize something like killing a bald eagle or spraying DDT, etc., or banning DDT, uh, or using it to incentivize certain things. Uh, like, I mean, I'm not a big tree. Okay, here's a good example. Because everybody loves talking about trees, but one thing I've worked on here is native prairie restoration. We did a project at Dunbar Cave State Park a few years back where we took a piece of land on the Pennyroyal Plain, and they, first thing they had to do was, burn it, get all the stuff out of there. and then replant and then burn again. Ideally, what you would have would be some bison or elephants in there stomping it up. But so no, I'm not pessimistic at all about our ability to use public policy and public initiatives, private initiatives to fix a lot of these things. And I think the I'm very hopeful about a healthier South, both in terms of environment and in terms of our people. Sandy started us off by talking about sweet tea, and it's the environmental effects on the people of the South, white and black, are massive. We have not just an obesity problem, but we have high cancer rates in a lot of areas, and we can fix that. We can fix that, and I'm sort of a multi. Let's use every tool we've got. Education, fitness clubs, whatever. We can get people healthy again. We can build a culture of health, and we can build a cultural environmentalism or conservationism, however you want to brand it. I don't care what the branding is. But you know, uh, another example of that would be, I think in the 1970s, they made a lot of progress against littering, which is sadly seems to have made a bit of a comeback, with, shaming people with television ads, with like that Italian guy pretending to be an Indian crying in the canoe, uh, and with penalizing it, $500 tickets. But when was the last time you saw a police officer handing out a ticket for littering? It does not happen much.
Mm.
So very hopeful.
Roland, that's a pretty good campaign pitch. I think I'll nominate you for president of the South, and I'll nominate Sandbatch here as your top advisor. I think that's a winning ticket, or maybe vice president. I don't know.
I want to be colonial governor of Cuba. That's my title. But I just wanted to add to this and really because point out that the thing about the South in particular, the reason why it's been fun to focus on recently is because we do have this ability. We can afford to be optimistic in a way that other parts of the country can't, I think, in part because we started from so far behind that, like we can fix things like, we can fix things like 10-year discrepancy and uh, you know, uh, uh, the length of someone's life. We can do that. We actually don't, and this is like one of those, we don't actually have the racial issues, a lot of the issues that other parts of the country. We have more wiggle room. We have more resources that we can move around. This is the only part of the country that I think in which that the politics are explicitly the problematic point where like if you were to go to if New York City, Chicago, these places have huge fiscal problems. They have huge baked in structural demographic problems that are that point at decline, and they may point at decline. The United States as a whole may be declining, but for the foreseeable future, the South's prominence and the South's position in the United States can almost only increase, and it's really just a question of what we do with it. Uh, rather than a question of if it's going to happen. So, can we use this sort of advantage that we've hoovered up, really in some cases through no agency of our own? Can we use this opportunity that's just been dropped in our lap um, to improve our image of ourselves? To get over things that we kind of, and I'm real bad about this. I keep lots of historical quandaries in the back of my head, and I carry them around with me. So and so I see this in other Southerners quite a bit, even ones that aren't as cognizant of it. And the question is, can we get over ourselves? Can we get over our past? Can we get over the way we think about ourselves and take advantage of what we've got here?
Is this part of kind of the goal of your project, the new writing project, Ecologica Americana? And do you want to talk a little bit about that before?
Yeah. I'm gonna start working on that a lot more. It's been real constrained because I have like problems with almost all of the publishing formats. I would like to be able to move more lateral. I've gotten unfriendly towards books because I don't like that books have to be read front to back, left. There's direct. I don't like there's single media. I would like to be able to do, more multimedia stuff and that sort of thing. And haven't been just real happy with the blog format either. Still not a lot of lateral expansion. But yeah, that's more or less what I'm talking about. And I've really coined a phrase that I call plantation history. And the historiography there that I'm competing with is it's a recent historiographical, like, sort of cordoning off of the last 500 years or so of modernity as something called the Anthropocene, and there've been subdivisions proposed for Capitalicene, plantation scene, so on and so forth. And I actually grabbed that one and I coined this phrase plantation history to describe what really I sort of think of as the data structure of the modern state. So, like, their issue, I think, Ashley Fitzgerald, where she talks about um, spreadsheet brain, and I'm really on that, really kind of on extrapolating that idea and applying it, everywhere. We'll look at something like how in the year 1600 there were 14, 15 known uses of elm trees. And within 100 years, because of this tendency to, cordon off marshal resources, put them in a spreadsheet, extract them, the number of, actual uses of elm trees had devolved down to two, and they were, lumber and pitch. And that ultimately resulted in clear cutting, European forests of elm trees to make lumber and pitch. Um, so I'll look at situations like that and I'll explain that in terms of a larger structure, like individual isolated instances of it, pointing out that this is actually this very large construction, multi-dimensional, like in almost infinitely dimensional structure of, the modern state that, I call the plantation, because it's tends to be very top down. It tends to be very extractive. It tends to advantage itself by causing people in the various links of this chain to be predatory with one another, to be competitive with one another in instances where obviously cooperation is the better, sort of the better outcome. And actually, because I didn't grab mythology earlier, I think mythology offers a much better solution here than ideology does, because any story, whenever, and really we're talking about shifting from, a political program is moving from history as politics to moving into history as narrative. And so, like, I would say that to mythologize the past, maybe in a way, instead of to ideologize the past. What we're doing is we're laying out a set. If we were to do this for the South, instead of having like a Moonlight and Magnolias Revenkist apologist text or something like that, or a story, the story we would lay out is, a set of conditions that we can all see that we agree on, a set of symbols, conditions, uh, you know, familiar information, landmarks that we can all identify with. This is the reason why I focus on the 1930s instead of the Civil War, because in the 1930s, everybody in the South was poor. Poke salad and collard greens, these are things that we all have in common with one another. And how we interact, so the grounds for us interacting with these landmarks are more interactive. If I take a Moonlight and Magnolia story to, certain, parts of the South, I'll be there. I'll be legendary among them. They'll follow me on Twitter. But if I take a plantation story to another group, or if I take Moonlight and Magnolia's drama to another group of Southerners, I'll make several enemies for life. And so the idea is to take our history, which has been fought over more than almost any other academic subject. This is the thing people don't know. There's been a book published about the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, or Abraham Lincoln every 5 minutes since the end of the Civil. This is, in terms of the amount of just pages that have been written about this subject, it dwarfs nearly every subject except the Christian religion in terms of like literary output. And there's relatively little that's been accomplished from it. So like we can like look at the way we're doing history here and we say this isn't working. It's making jobs for PhDs, but that's the only thing it's doing. We're gonna have to dramatically reassess the way we interact with history, and that's what always what I'm trying to do. And really, that started with this idea. I'm trying to sketch the outlines of this thing that's the plantation. So how does the plantation project time? How does it project space? How does it project how does it project concepts that we wouldn't normally think of as ideological onto the people that it marshals resources from. And I think this is a thing that I think is going to occur either way. It's just a question of who gets first mover advantage and who surrenders to it and who chooses to participate in the process rather than who gets steamrolled by it and forced to submit. And that's sort of what the project is.
So would it be fair to say that you're kind of trying to deconstruct what you're calling kind of plantation history in order to then, kind of have the wherewithal to reconstruct, a better vision, kind of what we were talking about earlier?
Right, exactly. Because I mean, forming a narrative is going to be important. People can talk about, there's the tech side of there's the tech side of things, there's the hardware side of things, there's the political side of things. We frequently have a hard time, and this is the thing, all of alt academia, for instance, and I think we all like sort of bought into the university concept of why the humanities are important, and we really just end up looking annoying whenever you find this is really what the humanities are for, is taking all of this other stuff, all these other things that have to be coordinated, they have to be justified, they have to be moved around, you have to place them in a narrative. And the thing that we would want to do is we want to create a narrative of history that as many people can participate, many people can understand as we can, that as many people can participate in as possible. So I mean, this is like it's a blog, but it's also kind of a like it's also kind of a this is another way you can think about yourself and the American project. You can look at the South if you're in the South, for instance, and I talk about the South more than I do anywhere else because I'm from here. You can look at things that aren't the Civil War. You can look at this weird hippo idea. You can look at the fact that essentially, our artificial intelligence, large language models, there's a Southern intellectual current that goes through actually the Southern agrarians, to their development, that there's other things that we've participated in. It's not just the Civil War. It's not just these kind of cultural meat hooks that we've come to hang our identity on, that there's this whole other robust story of the South as a part of the American project that we can focus on. And people have tried to do this before, but they usually try and do it from a really explicitly revisionist, perspective. They're really just fighting, they're really just taking off the red shirt and putting on the blue shirt. And I would really, and I'm trying, and this has been hard. This is hard. Like doing graduate school is one thing, but actually going and synthesizing something that nobody else is really working on has been more difficult than I imagined. But that's basically the idea is, okay, so what can we take from this thing? How can we form a narrative that is as empowering to as many people as possible without stepping on other people's toes? What do we have to work with? How can we engineer this narrative and how can we propagate it? And that's really what I'm concerned with.
Hmm. Well, I'm curious about your thoughts on this project. I mean, it sounds really cool to me. I'm curious your thoughts.
No, I'm fully on board with it. And if you go through some of my recent posts, I've been talking a lot about uh, Jung and Joseph Campbell, who was a Jungian, and some other Jungian writers, because I think Jungianism is one useful element to import here. Another element, I did a little picture post, considering there's this country song called "Will the Circle Be Unbroken," which is like sort of the theme song of the Grand Old Opry. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? And thinking about that as a narrative in the South, of mindscape kind of, and combining the Jungian hero's journey, which is a cyclical thing, and also the fourth turning crisis theory, which is also cyclical, and thinking about that in terms of Southern history and American history and personal history, and you can kind of read yourself into that as an individual and also see your community in that. And what I've got coming out, both Sandy and I are going to be in the summer edition of I Am 1776 Futurism. And my contribution to that relies is sort of a narrative. It's more Upper South focused on sort of the Scots Irish Greater Appalachian tradition. And it relies heavily on T.R. Fairbach, who wrote Texas, Lone Star, A History of Texas and the Texans, which is it's history, but it is Fairbach sort of delves. There's a mythological element to his writing, I think, which I really enjoy. Another good example is Born Fighting by Jim Webb, who is one of my heroes. And Jim traces the history of the Scots Irish people in this country from the time we got off the boat at Philadelphia and Charleston and follow the Great Wagon Road. And he talks about, what have we contributed to this? And so another angle of that, which people comes up sometimes, when people talk about the South, and the first time you had me on here, we sort of touched on it a bit. Uh, people, outsiders look at the South and the narrative, the historical narrative is all black, white. It is white versus black, white domination of black. And how do we, and part of the problem with that framing is that it creates an us versus them mindscape in a lot of people, which is then hard to break out of. And you end up like living the role that you have been assigned in eighth grade history class for the rest of your life, which is really depressing and defeatist. And it's not helping anybody. It's not helping anybody for us to continue in these, us and them patterns. And so one of the things I've been sort of delving in, which is highly controversial, and some of my readers, if they're listening to this, are not going to like this, but considering the relationship, and when I say relationship, I mean like the familial relationship, and the both in like a literal sense and in a cultural sense between white Southerners and black Southerners, and the things that we share between the two of us. Because if you really sit down and look at African Americans wherever they are, like when I was in college in California, when I was hanging out, sometimes I would want to go get some chicken and waffles. I think it was called Roscoe's, and it was a African American black restaurant, but this is just Southern food. Like it's a shared culinary culture. A lot of the musical culture is shared. There's, we can debate about that, but how do we create narratives which bind men together in a brotherhood, and help us to see our commonalities and help us to break out of these logic or history traps that you get stuck in, where you've got people on Twitter. I mean, people that there are accounts on Twitter that literally all they post about every day, all day, every day, 365 days a year is about the Civil War. And I hate to break it to you guys out there, but that is probably not a healthy amount of focus on the Civil War. And I enjoy the subject, but like if you're thinking about that like every day, all day, like something's wrong. This is like an undiagnosed, this needs to go in the DSM. Uh, yeah, so that's my perspective.
Yeah.
I'd say that as somebody, I say that as somebody who's been there. I've been there. It's not a good thing. And I also I really enjoyed the mention of Jung because I didn't read. I like now that I realize that there's you could like hear all kinds of Jung and everything that I was saying, and I had not read any Jung for almost 10 years, and then I picked it up again last week, and I get like going to do this thing where I like picked up like his response to Job. It's like picking up Nietzsche and saying I'll start with Antichrist, but I've recognized a lot of these concepts, and yeah, I mean I Jung is a guy that I've kind of settled on as and he had a real interesting background, and this is the reason why I kind of trust Jung. There's a moment in Jung's life when he's done a lot of his like famous psychology work already, but he gets brought in to Joseph Goebbels, and he later describes this meeting as like meeting Mephistopheles, where he's offered this all the resources to do everything he could ever want, and he turns it down. He gets horrified in this meeting with Goebbels, and he knows he has to be polite, and he politely turns it down, and he walks away. And that's the moment when he really starts writing Liber Novus, and he's actually working on a lot of the same problems, that we've talked about here. How do you navigate this way between ideology and anarchy? And it's quite a bit of his work is what went into sort of early formations, early psychological concepts of cybernetics, and they use a lot of the material where he talks about mythology. I was drawing it from Northrop Frye mostly, but turns out Northrop Frye was drawing it mostly from Jung. So yeah, there's a lot of Jung in the stuff I've been talking about.
Nice. Well, guys, I think we got to wrap this. I really enjoyed this conversation. Love to do some more sometime. Yeah. Any last thoughts before we wrap this?
No,
Now
I
I'm pretty
think that's
good.
good.
You both
Yeah.
made some pretty nice, compelling, last statements there. So I think we're good. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. Until next time.
All right, bud. Take care.
Bye.